Here's what nobody tells you about the night Ford lost Le Mans. The cars were fast enough. The engineers were brilliant enough. The money, and there was more money than any racing program in history had ever seen, was absolutely there. Ford lost Le Mans in 1965, not because Ferrari was better. They lost because a corporation the size of a small country tried to go racing and brought every single one of its worst habits with it. Boardroom politics, executive ego, a chain of commands so tangled it could strangle a man. Hi, my name is Johnny, and this is American Muscle, where we dig into the real stories behind the racing legends, the machines, and the men that Hollywood either got half right or didn't bother to get at all. The room where it happened, a scene the film never shows you. 1965, Le Mans. The race is over. Ferrari has won. Again. And somewhere near the Circuit de la Sarthe, a group of Ford Motor Company executives are sitting in a room, trying to figure out how to tell Henry Ford II that they just spent an almost incomprehensible amount of his money and have absolutely nothing to show for it. Henry Ford II, the man they called the Deuce, was not a person you wanted to disappoint. He was the grandson of the founder, the man who dragged Ford Motor Company back from the edge of collapse after World War II. He carried that name the way a heavyweight champion carries a belt, visibly, constantly, and with zero patience for people who wasted his time or his money. Here's what the film gets broadly right. The Deuce was furious after the Ferrari deal collapsed in 1963. What it doesn't show you is the specific, sustained, almost pathological nature of that fury. This wasn't a man who got angry and moved on. This was a man who redirected the resources of the second largest automaker in the world toward a single act of competitive revenge, and then sat back and waited for results like he was owed them. When those results didn't come in 1965, when all three GT40S retired from the race, when Ferrari crossed the line first for the 7th consecutive year, the room where Ford's executives gathered wasn't filled with quiet disappointment. It was filled with the particular silence that descends when powerful men realize they are about to be held accountable. Nobody talks in that silence. Nobody makes eye contact. Everyone is doing the same mental calculation. How much of this lands on me? Leo Beebe, Ford's director of special vehicles, was in that room. So were representatives from the Advanced Vehicles Division in England, the group actually responsible for building the GT40. And the conversation between those two groups tells you everything about why Ford nearly failed at Le Mans before they ever succeeded. The Americans wanted someone to blame. The British engineers wanted to fix the car. Those are two very different conversations. One of them is useful. One of them makes executives feel better for approximately 48 hours before the same problems resurface because nobody actually addressed them. Ford spent most of 1964 and 65 having the wrong one. And honestly, and I say this as someone who has spent way too many hours studying this program, that dynamic, suits versus engineers, perception versus reality, isn't unique to Ford in 1965. It's the oldest failure mode in any large institution. The names on the org chart change. The conversation stays exactly the same. Ferrari won that night because they built a better car. Ford lost that night because they were too busy assigning blame to understand why. The Ferrari deal that started it all. To understand what was happening inside Ford in 1965, you have to go back to 1963. And you have to understand that the Ferrari negotiation wasn't just a business deal that fell apart. It was the moment Henry Ford II took something personally that a man in his position almost never should. Here's the background the film rushes past. By the early 1960s, Ford's image problem was severe. The company that had invented the affordable automobile was now selling cars to people's parents. Safe cars, reliable cars, cars that said nothing remotely interesting about the person sitting behind the wheel. Lee Iacocca, yes, the same Lee Iacocca, had identified the youth market as Ford's salvation, and performance was the currency that bought credibility with young buyers. The logic was simple: win on Sunday, sell on Monday. It was the oldest principle in motorsport marketing, and Ford had been ignoring it while Ferrari built an empire on it. So, when Enzo Ferrari quietly let it be known in 1963 that he might be open to selling a controlling interest in his company, Ford moved fast. They sent a team to Maranello. Not just any team, they sent their best financial people, their best negotiators, and Don Frey, a metallurgical engineer who was sharp enough that Enzo Ferrari himself called him Dottor Ingegneri, Dr. Engineer. That's not a nickname Enzo handed out casually. The man was notoriously stingy with respect. The negotiations went well enough that Enzo was sketching potential combined logos. Think about that. Enzo Ferrari, the most proud, most proprietary figure in European motorsport, was sitting at a desk drawing pictures of what a Ford Ferrari badge might look like. And then Ford sent the contract. The specific clause that ended everything was Ford's insistence on controlling Ferrari's racing budget and race schedule. Enzo could keep his name on the cars. He could keep building road cars. But Ford wanted veto power over which races Ferrari entered, and how much money was spent entering them. For Enzo Ferrari, this was not a negotiating point. Racing wasn't a department of his company. Racing was his company, and everything else, the road cars, the celebrity clients, the mystique, existed to fund it. Ford was essentially asking him to sell his soul and keep the body. And Enzo Ferrari, who had spent 40 years building something from nothing in a country still rebuilding from war, said no. His exact words, filtered through his lawyer, Franco Gozzi, were unprintable in most publications and apparently spectacular in person. He called Ford executives worthless. He questioned their parentage. He had some thoughts about the size and aesthetic quality of American automobiles that were not complimentary. Henry Ford II's response, and this is the detail that explains everything that follows, was not calculated, it was not strategic, it was personal. He reportedly said, some variation of, we're going to go to Le Mans and we're going to beat him, not we're going to develop a racing program, not we're going to pursue a market strategy. We are going to beat him. One man talking about another man. That's the engine that powered everything, not corporate strategy, wounded pride. And wounded pride, it turns out, is a terrible foundation for a racing program. It generates urgency without patience. It demands results on a timeline that engineering doesn't respect. It puts suits in rooms where they don't belong, making decisions they're not qualified to make. Ford threw somewhere between $25 and $100 million at the Le Mans program, depending on whose accounting you trust. They had unlimited resources, the best American engineering minds, and a burning desire to win. What they didn't have, at least not in 1964 and 65, was the humility to listen to the people who actually knew what they were doing. Ford's secret weapon nobody talks about. Here's a name you almost certainly don't know, and you should. John Wyer. Wyer was a British racing manager who ran Ford's Advanced Vehicles division in Slough, England, the team actually responsible for building and developing the GT40. He was meticulous, precise, deeply knowledgeable, and almost constitutionally incapable of the kind of corporate performance that Ford's American executives expected from someone spending their money. He didn't do reassuring conference calls. He didn't produce optimistic progress reports. He told you what was wrong with the car and what it would take to fix it and how long that would take, and if you didn't like the answer, that was genuinely your problem because the answer was the answer. Ford's American racing establishment, led by Leo Beebe, found this approach maddening. Beebe was a Ford lifer, a company man in the truest sense, meaning his primary skill was managing upward, keeping Henry Ford II placated, and presenting the racing program in the most favorable possible light, regardless of what was actually happening. These two men, Wyer the engineer and Beebe the executive, were in fundamental conflict from the beginning of the program, and that conflict killed Ford's chances at Le Mans in 1964, and very nearly in 1965 as well. The GT40's early problems were serious and structural. The car was too tall, hence the GT40 designation, 40 inches roof height. It had aerodynamic instability at high speed that made it genuinely dangerous. The gearboxes were shattering under the stresses of Le Mans level endurance. These were not minor issues. These were not things you could resolve with a press release or a meeting about synergy. Wyer knew exactly what needed to be done. He needed time, resources, and the authority to make engineering decisions without having those decisions second-guessed by people in Detroit who had never felt a car go light at 200 miles per hour. What he got instead was interference, constant, well-funded, entirely counterproductive interference. By 1965, Ford had begun routing around wire entirely, bringing in Shelby American and other contractors to work on the GT40 alongside the advanced vehicles team. From a pure horsepower standpoint, this wasn't entirely wrong. Shelby's team brought genuine racing expertise and the 7-liter Ford V8 that would eventually turn the GT40 into a weapon. But here's the thing, nobody in the film mentions. The decision to bring Shelby in as the primary team for 1966 effectively ended John Wyer's involvement with the program he had built. The man who understood the GT40 better than anyone alive was quietly pushed aside by the corporate machine that never quite trusted him. Wyer went on to run Gulf Oil's privateer GT40 program and won Le Mans in 1968 and 69 with the same basic car, the car he'd built, without Ford's corporate apparatus telling him how to do his job. Sometimes the people asking the questions are the problem, not the answers. The corporate machine versus the racing men. Let me tell you about the specific texture of the conflict between Ford's corporate structure and the racing men who were supposed to be executing their vision. Leo Beebe was not a villain. I want to be precise about that because the film makes him one, and the reality is more interesting and more troubling than villainy. Beebe was a man doing exactly what corporations reward people for doing: managing perception, maintaining relationships, protecting the institution. His problem was that he was doing those things inside a context, professional motorsport at the highest level, where none of those skills are useful, and several of them are actively dangerous. Racing programs run on trust. The driver trusts the engineer trusts the data. The team trusts that when a decision needs to be made at 2 in the morning, with a car on a jack and rain coming, the person making that decision actually knows what they're talking about. Corporate hierarchy is the enemy of that kind of trust, because corporate hierarchy inserts people into the chain of command based on seniority rather than competence. And Ford's chain of command for the Le Mans program was long, genuinely, impressively long. Decisions that should have taken minutes took days. Engineering changes that Shelby's team, or Wyer's team, identified as necessary had to travel up the systems through layers of Ford bureaucracy before they could be approved, and they frequently came back modified in ways that reflected executive preference rather than engineering reality. Ken Miles understood this. Shelby understood this. Wyer had understood it and been removed partly for understanding it too loudly. The specific flashpoint, the moment where corporate logic and racing logic collided most catastrophically, was driver selection. Ford's marketing department had opinions about which drivers represented the Ford brand most effectively. These opinions were not always aligned with which drivers were fastest or most likely to keep an expensive prototype alive for 24 hours. Miles was repeatedly problematic for Ford's image people. He was British. He was blunt. He was not telegenic in the way American corporate marketing of up the 1960s understood telegenic. He drove brilliantly and spoke his mind freely, and these two qualities were apparently difficult to package. The film captures something true here, even while exaggerating the specifics. The tension between Miles's value as a driver and his inconvenience as a public relations asset was real, and it expressed itself in decisions about race entries, about car assignments, about who got the faster chassis, that had less to do with winning races than with managing a narrative. This is the part that should make you angry. Ford was spending $100 million, or something in that vicinity, nobody's accounting was that clean, on a racing program, and some portion of the decisions inside that program were being made based on how a British mechanic from Birmingham would look on the cover of a Ford promotional brochure. Carroll Shelby spent most of 1965 and 66 fighting this reality with every tool available to him. Some of those fights he won, the ones he lost tend to be the ones history remembers. The night of the race. What the cameras didn't show, 1966, Le Mans. This is the race the film is actually about. And here's where the gap between Hollywood and history becomes most instructive. The film presents the 1966 race as a close battle between Ford and Ferrari that goes down to the wire. The reality is that by midnight, Ferrari was in 12th place. Ford's real competition wasn't Italian, it was internal. Dan Gurney in the Ford #1 car was leading the race and running faster than anyone. Miles was pushing hard behind him, and inside Ford's pit lane, there was a growing tension between the people who wanted to race and the people who were beginning to calculate what a Ford 1-2-3 finish would mean for the press release. When Gurney's engine blew 6 hours before the finish, catastrophically, conclusively, with no possibility of repair, the dynamic inside Ford's operation changed completely. Miles inherited the lead. The race was effectively won, and that's when the conversation began. Here's the sequence of events that the film compresses and slightly distorts. With 3 Ford GT40S running in formation and Ferrari out of contention, team management made the decision to slow all 3 cars and bring them across the finish line together. The stated reason was ensuring all 3 cars finished. The actual reason was a photograph. Ford wanted the image of 3 cars crossing the line simultaneously. It was a marketing decision dressed up as a racing decision. Beebe approached Shelby. Shelby, and this is his own account, the one he carried as guilt for the rest of his life, said yes. Not because he was ordered to, because he looked at Beebe and instead of saying what he thought, he asked what Beebe thought. And Beebe said he'd like to see all 3 cross together, and Shelby said, let's do it that way then. One casual exchange, 2 men who both thought they were being reasonable. And Ken Miles, who was at that moment not merely leading Le Mans, but leading the only race that would ever give a single driver the Daytona Sebring, Le Mans triple in a single year, was told to slow down and wait for his teammates. Miles, to his absolute credit, complied. A Shelby mechanic heard him say, "So ends my contribution to this bloody motor race," and throw his sunglasses across the pit. Then came the moment nobody in Ford's war room had anticipated. The French officials, applying the rules with Gallic precision, determined that in case of a tie, the winner would be the car that had covered the greater distance from its starting position. McLaren's car, which had started further back on the grid, was declared to have covered marginally more distance. Ken Miles, who had led the race, who had been on pace to lap every car except his own Ford teammates, was classified second. Beebe's reaction, when he understood what had happened, was reportedly genuine horror. "Oh my God, that is not what we wanted at all. Is there any way we can protest this?" There wasn't. The photograph Ford had wanted so badly, 3 cars crossing the line together, had cost their best driver the greatest achievement in endurance racing history. And the achievement still hasn't been matched, not in the 60 years since. The Daytona Sebring Le Mans triple in a single season remains the most elusive record in motorsport, standing empty on a shelf that Ken Miles almost reached. The morning after, here's what happened inside Ford headquarters in the days following Le Mans 1966 that nobody bothered to document carefully and everyone involved preferred to forget. Ford had won, officially, triumphantly, completely. The press coverage was everything the marketing department had hoped for. The photograph of the 3 GT40S crossing together ran everywhere. Henry Ford II got his revenge on Enzo Ferrari in the most public possible arena. And internally, quietly, the reckoning began. Because winning hadn't actually resolved the tension that had defined Ford's racing program from the beginning. The conflict between Beebe's corporate machinery and Shelby's racing operation hadn't been eliminated by a trophy. It had simply been papered over by one. Ken Miles, in the immediate aftermath, was remarkable. He gave interviews, he praised Ford. He said, "Please be careful how you report what I have said. I work for these people. They have been awfully good to me." That is the statement of a professional man absorbing an enormous injustice with more grace than the situation deserved, and protecting the people responsible for that injustice while he did it. Nobody in Ford's executive structure publicly acknowledged that Miles had been wronged. The internal conversations, whatever they were, stayed internal. The official line was that Ford had won Le Mans. Technically, by every measure that appeared in the record books, this was true. What also happened in the weeks following Le Mans was that Ford continued developing the experimental J car, the prototype that was supposed to be the GT40's successor, the car with the distinctive breadloaf rear end, the car with aerodynamic properties that weren't fully understood, the car that had already killed Walt Hanskin, a 4-time champion, during testing at the Le Mans test weekend in April 1966. Ford resumed J-car testing that August. They put Ken Miles in it. Miles, who was the best test driver Carroll Shelby had ever seen. Miles, who had just given everything to a company that had just taken something irreplaceable from him. On August 17, 1966, at Riverside International Raceway in California, the J car's rear end lifted its speed on a downhill straight. The car went out of control at somewhere around 200 miles per hour. Miles was ejected. He was dead before emergency crews reached him. His son, Peter, 15 years old, was at the track that day. He watched it happen. The cause was never officially determined. The fire that consumed the wreckage destroyed most of the evidence. But in the years since, the physics have become clear. The J car's distinctive rear end was generating lift at race speeds, like a wing, like a car trying to become an aircraft. Ford's internal response to Miles's death was to mandate roll cages in subsequent versions of the car. The significantly revised J car became the Ford Mark IV. That roll cage almost certainly saved Mario Andretti's life when he crashed at Le Mans in 1967 and walked away. Ken Miles died, and the cars got safer. He made it possible from beyond the grave. Nobody inside Ford's executive structure said this loudly either. What Ford got right was, and what it cost them. Here's the complicated truth about Ford's Le Mans program that neither the film nor the corporate mythology quite captures. Ford got it right. Eventually, painfully, at enormous cost, financial, human, and moral. They got it right. After 1966, with the lessons of Miles's development work baked into the DNA of the GT40, Ford dominated Le Mans in a way that remains almost without parallel in the race's history. They won in 1966, 67, 68, and 69, 4 consecutive years. They drove Ferrari out of endurance racing entirely, forcing the Italian manufacturer to redirect their attention to Formula One. The car that Miles had developed, the car he had taken from a dangerous prototype that scared its own drivers into a machine that could run flat out for 24 hours without braking, became one of the most successful racing cars ever built. John Wyer, the engineer Ford had pushed aside, won Le Mans twice more with the GT40 in a Gulf Oil privateer program. The car outlasted the program that built it. Carroll Shelby lived with him the photo finish decision for 46 years, until his death in 2012. He said, "I'll forever be sorry. Ken was 1.5 laps ahead and he'd have won the race. It broke his heart. Then we lost him in August." Shelby American never returned to Le Mans endurance racing after 1967. The team that had beaten Ferrari on Ferrari's own ground simply walked away. Shelby said, "Losing Ken broke his heart. For a man who defined himself entirely by competition, by going back for more, regardless of what it cost. That withdrawal is the most eloquent statement he ever made." Henry Ford II got his victory. He got his 4 consecutive wins. He got the photograph and the press coverage and the revenge on Enzo Ferrari that he had wanted since 1963. What he never publicly reckoned with, what Ford as a corporation never publicly reckoned with, was what that victory had cost the men who actually achieved it. Ken Miles was posthumously inducted into the Motorsports Hall of Fame of America in 2001, 35 years after his death. 3.5 decades during which the man who developed the GT40, who won Daytona and Sebring, who was on pace to lap every car at Le Mans, except his own Ford teammates, was known only to the people who had been there. The corporate machinery that used him and denied him, and then lost him before anyone could make it right, moved on efficiently to the next program. That's what corporate machinery does. It moves on. The men who actually knew Ken Miles did not move on. Shelby didn't. Peter Miles, his son, has never returned to Le Mans. Molly Miles, his widow, wrote to Road and Track in November 1966 and said something that cuts through everything. "Nothing could ever replace what I have lost." It has been a great life out here in California. Sometimes controversial, sometimes turbulent, but we have been happy. A man who had built something worth having, with people worth loving, doing work that genuinely mattered to him. Taken on a Tuesday afternoon in the California desert by a car that shouldn't have been running, testing for a company that had just taken the greatest achievement of his career and handed it to someone else. Here's what the night Ford lost Le Mans, the real night, the one that happened in boardrooms and pit lanes and executive suites rather than on the track itself, actually built. It built a dynasty, 4 consecutive victories, the permanent humiliation of Ferrari in endurance racing, one of the most iconic racing cars in history, safety standards that protected drivers for decades afterward, including at least one life we can name with certainty. Mario Andretti, Le Mans, 1967. It also built a monument to the specific way corporations destroy the things they depend on, not through malice, not through stupidity, but through the particular combination of ego, bureaucracy, and the inability to listen to people who know more than you do, which is how large institutions have always failed the individuals who make them great. Say Ford versus Ferrari, the film gave us the version of this story we needed. The underdog narrative, the brilliant outsider, the corporate villain, the triumph and the tragedy. Christian Bale's Ken Miles is one of the great performances in modern American cinema, and it brought a man who deserved recognition, 35 years of overdue acknowledgement. That matters genuinely and enormously. But the real story is messier and more human, and ultimately more damning than 2.5 hours of cinema can contain. The real story is about what happens when wounded pride replaces sound judgment at the top of an organization. About the casual conversation that can end a legacy. About the test driver who made every car he touched better than it was before he arrived, and who died doing thankless invisible work for people who would spend decades afterward wishing they had done right by him. Ken Miles didn't lose Le Mans in 1966, he won it. By every measure that matters in motor racing, speed, skill, endurance, mechanical understanding, sheer accumulated hours of brilliant driving, he won it completely. What happened inside Ford the night they lost Le Mans is that they forgot, briefly and fatally, that the men who win races are not interchangeable components in a corporate program. They are the program. Everything else, the money, the machinery, the marketing, is just the supporting cast. Ken Miles was the whole show, and Ford, to their permanent discredit, only figured that out after he was gone. I'm Johnny, this is American Muscle. If you want the real stories behind the legends Hollywood simplified, you just found your home.